Well, welcome everybody to this session. I'm glad to see we've got quite a lot of people here. We've been trying to market this really, really heavily all day and yesterday. The topic is called Regulatory Simplification, Streamlining and Convergence. And to be perfectly honest, we were completely in awe of the topic. It is so broad, we had no idea really what we were going to attack about it. And some of the kind of subjects or issues that sprang to mind when we looked at it were, removal of old unnecessary regulation, the review of regulatory approach to ensure that we only regulate where necessary, and challenging our existing regulatory models and structures, review of organizational structures in regulators, merging of different regulators, merging content and kind of network economic type regulators, whether that's good or bad, the impact of OTT platforms on the conventional regulatory framework, whether that has an impact on defining the markets that you apply ex-ante regulation in, whether you can apply ex-ante regulation to platform businesses, and whether or not actually some of these changes mean that we need to move our focus a bit from ex-ante more to ex-post. And then lastly, but by no means least, also the horizontal type regulation that the conventional regulators now have to deal with, including privacy, data protection, the impact of AI, all kinds of other issues that are not within the conventional skill set of regulators. The only thing we do know is that everything's going to change, and it is changing at a really rapid pace. Yesterday we had a really interesting session at the end of the RF on AI, and I think the consensus there was that for regulators, sector regulators, for now the brief is to really try and understand, to explore, and to be ready, to kind of be on the front foot whenever something is necessary to do, but we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know what the challenge is going to be, but we know it will be one. So unless we really try to make sure that we understand and explore in a collaborative way, we could get caught out on that. But that's kind of long-term preparation. Many of the kind of topics I mentioned a minute ago are really about tidying up history as well. It's about trying to make sure that we remove old unnecessary regulation. In one of the earlier sessions today, people were saying, what is that? Hopefully we can actually get a good discussion about what that is now. Get a discussion about the pros and cons of merging regulators, as I mentioned before, and also the issues about how do we deal with the horizontal versus vertical regulatory skill set and challenges that we have. Now, in topic of moving old regulation, I think one thing that is quite a challenge here is really what is old and unnecessary regulation? Maybe it's not just unnecessary, maybe it's actually stopping us going forward. Maybe it is reinforcing and fossilizing the actual kind of the structures of the past, the industry model, the market structure, so that innovation that would otherwise happen is not happening because we're kind of stuck in the old structures. And again, that brings us on to the ex-ante versus ex-post type issue. Do we really need ex-ante anymore? I mean, is it so that we can't get competition in the electronic communication spectrum unless we have ex-ante? Because that was the justification initially. It was about those huge big barriers to competition and market entry, that there had to be ex-ante regulation. But the thing is that ex-ante regulation is something we do in advance, before something happens. That kind of assume some level of stability over a period of time over which you are applying a set of rules and regulations, but at the pace of change, that could really be quite challenging. So I think we need to explore that as well if we get around to it. So lots and lots of things to do. I think what we want to do here, and that's kind of the beginning we've done in terms of sitting the way we are, we want to have a conversation. It's such a big topic, and we decided the best way of addressing that topic was to say each of the three panelists, who I'll introduce in a second to you, will pick a number of those kind of sub-issues and talk about them for a few minutes, and the other two will make a quick remark. And then we can have a conversation about that topic before we move on to the next. So anybody who has any issues, any queries, anything at all, or anything that wasn't said that should have been said, please say so. But on the other hand, if there's actually a preference to have a conversation at the end, we'll do that. We've got an hour and 40 minutes or so, and it's our time, and we'll spend it the way that it works best for all of us. So one thing that is also important is the panel members are all regulators. And I think one of the points that kind of came to me when I was thinking about what's my role going to be in all of this. And I think maybe one of them is to try and represent some of the other stakeholders. I'm hoping there are other people here who are not regulators who actually want to kind of pipe up and say something about what it means to them. What does it mean to them to be regulated? What does it mean to them if we remove all these regulations? Does it take away a safety net that they need, or does it give them some freedom that they've been desperate to get? All those kinds of issues. So unless somebody else pipes up and talks on their behalf, I'll do my best to try and challenge from that perspective. So enough of that. Didn't introduce myself, by the way. I'm Gita Sorensen. I run GOS Consulting. We do consultancy in electronic communications, kind of regulatory, strategy, economic stuff. There's a folder floating around of what we do, so have a look if you're interested. I'll now move on to introducing our panelists. My first panelist is Juan Manuel Wilches. Is that right? Good, yeah. Juan is a commissioner at the Commission for Communications Regulation in Colombia, and he's been working in the sector since 2000. First, he was an advisor to the Telecoms Regulatory Commission and advised on a whole wide range of issues for 7 years. Then he moved in to join the National Spectrum Agency, and he was promoted to Deputy Director of Spectrum Agency and Planning, where he developed the National Spectrum Management Policy. And he's subsequently been appointed as Commissioner in 2016 and Executive Director in 2014 of the Communications Regulatory Commission. And his introductory contribution today will be about the need for converged regulators. Whether or not the convergence of telecoms with content and audiovisual regulation is a route we need to go to, how platform businesses are impacting on the scope and the ability and the role and necessity of what the regulator is doing, the conventional regulator. People like Netflix, WhatsApp, Viber, and Skype, what do they actually mean to the structure of the market? How we define the markets and how we regulate them, and can we regulate them? Does ex-ante regulation even properly apply to them? My second panelist is Allyson Nemeth. She is a media advisor to the chairman of the FCC, who we heard speak earlier today. She advises on media issues, including broadcast radio, TV, cable, and the broadcast incentive auction. Before she joined the chairman's office, she served as legal advisor in his media bureau before, and she came to the commission through the FCC's Attorneys Honours Programme. So she not only has the ear of the FCC's chairman, she actually creates some of his positions and issues, so we're going to be looking forward to what she's got to say. Her particular topic will be about streamlining. It will be about regulating across different parts of the regulatory structure, looking at the different parts of the FCC in terms of the spectrum, the fiber, the consumer protection, all those aspects. How do you get them to talk to each other, get it to work? And how do you evaluate the removal of redundant regulatory interventions, making sure we don't over-regulate new technologies for the sake of it because they're a little bit scary to start with. So that's going to be her main focus. And then the last panelist is Rainer Schnepfleitner, who is the head of regulatory affairs at the Competition and Regulatory Authority in Qatar. And he's worked at the Austrian regulator, he has worked at the DG competition in the EU, and he's worked for Swisscom, where he was head of regulatory accounting, before he then went and worked in Qatar. So he has a really wide spectrum of experience to share. And his focus will be on the need for regulators to straddle sector-specific regulation with horizontal regulation, as we said, things like privacy, data protection, the impact of AI, and other issues, so that looking at how to do that and how it challenges the skill set and the structure of the regulator to make sure that regulation remains relevant and potent, I think. So with that, I will hand you over to Juan, who will start with the first topic.
Thanks a lot, Gita. I would like to take advantage of the fact that we are in Mexico and that I can speak in Spanish. So if you have your, I would invite you to use the translation device. Oh.
That's the only point that you hadn't discussed.
I had actually discussed it. I just forgot to tell them.
Gita said that I wanted to talk about the convergence of regulators. We're currently in the process of becoming a convergent regulator. There's a draft law being passed through Congress. Government is expecting for that to be issued by December this year. So there's a chance that he or she could become a convergent regulator. There's another agency in charge of television issues. And those issues are being discussed right now. So I'm going to switch to Spanish.
Fine. Yeah, you're doing fine. Excellent. Come on, encourage you.
En este momento estamos en el proceso de discusión de
discussing this bill. This bill aims at uniting two unities, the National Commission of Telecommunications and the Television Authority. Because, well, as in many other countries, the Mexican case is a recent case, because there is a need. Communication services have been being provided in a convergent way. All of the services are mounted onto those networks, and users are used to consuming those services in such a way that they only need an account with a single operator, and that's enough. However, in Colombia, the topic is very difficult. For instance, attention to consumers, well, has two authorities. We have two consumer protection attorneys' offices, and this makes the formalities very complicated, or the way in which one can access to the benefits of having a single regulator, and that's the reason why we have this dynamics of converging to that one single regulator. What have we done from the point of view of regulation simplification? And I want to broaden here the topic, because it's not just simplification, it's also regulation enhancement. We must not just simplify, which means eliminating, but also enhancing a regulation. And this entails different types of actions. We have realized that, of course, the digital environment and provision of services is or has ever more challenges. There are a lot of digital players entering the game in the market, and that must be taken into account in market analysis. A regulator like us, with a limitation for telecommunication services, has a lot of limitations actually in order to intervene in different markets. For instance, the definition of a market is difficult. Let's say market of content. We realized that the provision of content of wholesale content, or the chain of content productions could they could have some market failures, but today laws do not allow us to intervene in those markets in particular. So if we were an agent regulator, we could generate that intervention, and from here, well, we started to see the behavior of the different market variables. For instance, revenue from in the sector at the end of the second quarter of 2018, last semester, we have 8 quarters where we have had an increase in the revenue of the sector, given the decrease of the growth in voice services, which had not been added to the services of data and TV, and that change that operators have to conduct to manage to change the mix of income from voice to data and to content services is a very difficult one, and this makes us think as regulators that we need somehow to revert to the way in which we are issuing our regulations, because we cannot continue thinking in telecommunications, in traditional telecommunication companies, but we have to think in companies offering comprehensive telecommunication services which are cross-wide in nature, addressing the needs of the consumers in a comprehensive way. And by this I mean that communications operators possibly have to migrate, and we have spoken about this and discussed this in several editions, previous edition of this conference, and they have to migrate to the platform schemes where services which are integrated, from traditional, to IT solutions, plus analytical data, plus another digital data are being generated, which are going to generate the revenue for the sector. And in this sense, we have to, we are starting to listen about traditional operators like a series of requirements or requests they are raising. They're asking us to have incentives for investment. It's very easy to say it, but very difficult to implement it. This can come to be difficult, the implementation of these digital services. This can entail a lot of things. This is not just about a regulation, but also about enhancing the way in which the regulation is issued, also regulatory activities with OTTs, those online platforms providing content services in the case of our sector, and other services such as WhatsApp, through which we can make phone calls, if we can call them that. How can we balance those services with traditional operators, clear public policies depending on the policy agency, in which in this case it's not the agency but the ministry responsible for this, which definitely have to be coordinated, policy and implementation. In the case of CBC, they have come to ask the review of taxes, even if these are defined by the Ministry of Finance. So we cannot intervene in the topic of taxes, but communications operators are asking us to do something to enhance this and the conditions of the task situation. Based on this, CTC defined last year at the end of 2017 and included in its regulatory agenda for the years to 2018-2019 an initiative called regulation enhancement. And we did not include this as a simplification but as enhancement, because we wanted to review in which ways we could make a better regulation. And to solve this, what we did was to divide the strategy or the way to tackle this topic through 4 different initiatives. The first of which is analysis of regulatory impact as part of the process of access of Colombia to the OECD. We were requested to implement measures of regulatory impact on the decisions being made by the government in all the different sectors. In the case of CTC, we are looking for effectiveness and transparency, and we have implemented a series of additional processes. We already had some working, but above all, we have focused a lot on the identification of the problem. That is one of the key elements, in my opinion. And in here we have to identify what's the real cause of the problem, and not start thinking about the symptoms, but actually target the disease and correct it. One case of this not so long ago, we were deciding about the possibility for communications operators to be able to sell the cell phones, the mobile phones, together with a services plan from 2014. These are restricted because we found that there were practices which were not very good for the consumers at the moment of the sale of mobile phones, the terminals, what we call the terminals. So we limited the plan of services with the device. And when we started to identify this year how we could solve this situation, there was a difference between what communications operators can do and what other terminal commercializer can do, and we found market failure. And in here we got to a problem which was as big as having the need to improve the appropriation of users in Colombia of internet, and that's the problem we got after conducting several cycles of review to get to know what was the problem we had to solve, and this is what was allowed by this double sale of the service with the terminal. But in here we had to review and we had to solve the totality of the problem, and we have to consider some of the problems that can arise from the changing in regulations and focusing on the regulators' need and not just making decisions because they seem to be the best. So this regulatory analysis evaluation entails by the regulator also to change the mindset, not just of the people, of the decision makers, but also of the working teams who have to go beyond situations and problems so they can really focus on what this must be. This analysis includes Gita was saying before ex ante, ex post analysis to determine what the impact of the regulation is, and we have obtained a very good results. And as we provide all of this analysis procedure, we can provide this more easily faced to the different stakeholders. So decisions in here, I could say that they are self-sustained and they are justified by this analysis that has been conducted. The second aspect that we are working on in that task of regulation enhancement is the creation of an agenda where we are going to have the engagement of all of the stakeholders. We are ever more looking for the engagement of these stakeholders in the sense that they have to tell us what their needs, their problems are, and that's why we are defining what the challenges are that we have to define for all of the agenda. The second axis. Now the third axis is the ecosystem, and seriously we have conducted several studies related to the problems that I introduced at the beginning of the digital environment and how that dynamics of the new digital platforms with traditional services. We have to understand it as regulators because we cannot continue making decisions thinking as communications regulators without understanding what happens with platforms and their effect, not just on our sector but also on the other economy sectors, because these are cross-wide, and if we make a decision in our sector, we are going to end up affecting other sectors of the economy. Also, for this case, we have 4 different studies, one on e-commerce, another on post services, the logistics change, which is a support for e-commerce, and also we have another study, a roadmap for digital economy, which is a suggestion concerning political and regulatory aspects for different entities of the government. Now we are going into difficult terrain because quite likely we're going into the terrain of other government institutions, but as regulator and rather as government advisors, we want to have a vision of what the ICT's impact is on the rest of the economy. And the last component, so I don't speak any further, which is a focus on regulation simplification. Well, we have different phases here, the elimination of norms which are no longer used and which have no usefulness within the regulatory framework. Right now we have identified 23% of the existing regulation that can be fully eliminated, 18%, I'm sorry, and 5% can be simplified, can be reduced. So, besides, we have applied a three-phase design. We are applying here 3 criteria to simplify regulation. The first of which is seniorship. The last 2 topics that we have reviewed we are not going to go through them again because we have to generate some legal stability and security. We cannot generate change after change. And number 2, if we are working on a project, if we are having an ongoing task, a simplification is going to take place within this project. And the third one, which I consider to be one of the most important for us, the regulators, is the evaluation of all of the measurements of the costs that each one of these measures implies for the different market stakeholders. And right now we are closing a public tender and we are simplifying the topics which are the most difficult for the communications operators. And I can tell you that in the first place, we have the information reports that we request the operators for what it costs, what they cost for them. It may seem not important for us, but for them it is. And secondly, we have some measures that we have been implementing in the last 3 years to control the use of mobile phones theft. Also, it's a difficult topic in Colombia because it's a complex topic in our country, but we're having very high results in here, and we want to see if there is a possibility to reduce cost in the future of those measures. I'm going to leave this in here, and maybe later on we can dip in these topics. Muchas gracias, Juan. Hay muchas cosas que cubriste aquí. Nos has
Can
dado
I
mucho para
ask
una
Alison
conversación.
to quickly give a thought on this, and then subsequently Rainer?
Sure. Thank you, Gita. And thanks, Juan. That was very interesting. 3 points, I think, that I took from that I think are very prevalent at the FCC as well are, you mentioned the definition of market is now very difficult with the introduction of all these new technologies. That's something that we deal with in a lot of sectors of the FCC. One example, just from my media background, is, for instance, broadcasters. You know, we used to look at the market as just being broadcasters, and they only compete against themselves. And that's just not true anymore. You know, we don't have jurisdiction over all the over-the-top providers, but when you do look at the market and you see who they're competing against not only broadcasters, but they're competing against all the over-the-top technologies, Netflix, and even Google and Facebook in terms of ad revenue. So something that we think about a lot, and it certainly is a challenge. Another thing that we talked about, or that you mentioned, is the regulatory impact analysis, and that's something that we look at as well quite a bit. Every time we implement a new regulation, we try to think about the costs and benefits of implementing or eliminating that regulation. And each of our regulations definitely has to be justified. And I think it was an interesting point that you made that every regulation winds up affecting something else in the economy. You know, this sector that we regulate is 1/6 of the national economy, and we do have quite a bit of effect over other sectors, whether we realize it or not. So something to take into consideration.
Thank you so much, Juan. I will come back later also in my speech a little bit, is what makes an effective regulator. It always depends on the environment. And just to pick up on one point, as you mentioned, the change from voice to data is a painful experience for the operators. I'm very glad to say that, at least for my market, the operators made the switch. If I look at the ARPU of the operators in Qatar, in mobile, they remained absolutely at the same level for the last 10 years. Which is fantastic. We had decreasing prices, but the operators were very successful in targeted markets specifically, and whatever is reduced prices, people are now paying more, or they're buying higher priced terminals. The other point I wanted to pick up is on the information requests. And we are fully aware that the service providers, they are screaming and shouting whatever you want from them. But in my experience, as a regulator, you need to be extremely careful, especially if you consider to move from ex ante to ex post. And if you would like to have some very targeted and effective regulation, you need a lot of data. You need a lot of precise data in order not to make the wrong decisions. And I think we will also come back to this later, what is too much and what is the right level.
Thanks very much. Juan, just what occurred to me was that is a lot of activities you're going through at the moment. It's a lot of change, and it's quite a concentrated effort. What's the period over which it's happening, and what's the reaction by the sector to you doing this?
Well, we've been working on this for I don't know, the last couple of years. We started changing the way we thought about regulation about ending 2015, the beginning of 2016, because we did a strategic planning exercise, internal exercise, and we found out that we were trying to think what the CRC was going to be like in 2025. What we found out is that if we continued doing the same thing, we were going to disappear altogether. So we needed to think on how to reposition ourselves in terms of probably continue being a regulator, because we have to continue controlling or having regulation for certain specific things that need to be regulated in our market. But we needed to position ourselves as an advisor to government, because that's one of the other functions that we have. And because of that, we needed to go into the digital transformation, understanding of what's happening there. What effect do platforms have on our market? But also, we decided not to stay limited to our market, the telecom market, but we decided to go over the limits of what we had and try to analyze what is the effect of those kind of new digital services in the whole economy. Because I guess we didn't find that anyone else in government was doing that, and we started to propose things that needed to be done. Right now, what we're seeing is that by the end of the previous government and the beginning of this one, which started in last August, we don't know if it's because the CRC gave some recommendations or not, or probably it's because we needed to get there at some point in time. But there are changes that are being made in government. For example, the new president decided to have a high counselor, which has like a ministerial level on digital issues. And he decided to do that because he knows, the president knows that digital issues for the economy are very important. We need to have someone to coordinate that from top, and to coordinate all the different initiatives from the different ministries and public offices. One of the examples that I always give is tax reform that was issued in 2016, at the end of 2016. And on that tax reform, they charged 4% more on the value-added tax to mobile services. So that's a kind of a setback from, we need to promote digital adoption. And if you put on, if you have a tax, additional tax on consumers, they're not gonna go on and use the service and connect to internet. So we need to coordinate among different governmental organizations. And I guess that line of thought, that having the presidency lead the discussion on that, is very, very good for the whole government, and how we can approach decisions. Not just that, but for example, how do we as government need to deal with digital platforms in tourism, transportation, all the different sectors. If we take a decision on one of those sectors and it's not the appropriate decision, it's difficult for another governmental agency to say something different. So we need to coordinate beforehand, so we can coordinate all the different efforts and see the impact of one of those decisions in other markets.
I mean, I was going to move on to ask you about the whole platform, the impact on the platform businesses, and what your ambitions are with that. I mean, if I were a conventional provider of telecom services in Colombia, I would be salivating at the prospect of you regulating the platform operators. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I shouldn't comment on, because that is a very complex issue. But how are you? First of all, how are you dealing with, I guess, jurisdictional issues on that? But secondly, also, what is your ambition to try and achieve?
Well, when you were talking, I was thinking about an example. A telecom operator requested from a center letter to us, I guess it was 2016. They were telling us that we should regulate WhatsApp because they were providing telephony service, mobile telephony service, and that we had to impose the same regulation that they have in terms of quality of service and a lot of things. When we got those kind of positions from the industry, it was kind of difficult, because I don't know, you as a regulator think you really think that we can intervene that kind of or take those kind of decisions. But I guess we had to open the discussion and talk about digital economy and try to think about the digital transformation of our own industry. And we started to talk with industry market players And now you can see that some of them have partnered with other market players. Telefonica and Netflix now have an agreement. Claro, América Móvil has their own digital platform for content. And all of them are, we see now that they are convinced that the way forward is to partner with companies from the digital world so that they can complement their offer and provide digital services. So that's the way we're trying to deal with the things in our own sector. And with other sectors, what we did, I was talking about how we could position ourselves as advisors to government. And I can tell you a month ago, we had a meeting with the Deputy Minister for Tourism. He was asking from different governmental agencies, the tax agency, from the CRC, from the Ministry of ICTs. He was asking on the possibility of imposing taxes on platforms that provide accommodation services. Because he's a forward-thinking person, but he doesn't have all the information at hand to take that decision. So he's trying to take a decision based on Ministry of ICTs or the tax agency or the CRC that have already gone through all the analysis and considered the different approaches that could be taken in a decision for the tourism sector. So we could be advisors to either the presidency or to the Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Trade, or Ministry of Finance. And that's the way we've tried to approach our, how to get more knowledge and manage that knowledge so that we can transfer it to whoever needs to understand how the digital environment works. Because we think is that it's easier for us that are part of the ICT industry to understand some of the things that happen with the new digital platforms or digital services. So we could be advisors to them. We don't want to regulate other sectors. We don't want to get involved in taking decisions for them, but we can advise other governmental agencies on that work.
Puts a completely new kind of interpretation on convergence, doesn't it? Yeah. And I quite like the operator's approach is if you can't beat them, join them. Does anybody have anything they want to particularly talk about in this context? Yeah, we have somebody over here. Can we get a speaker because we need to, Mike, because we need to get the translators to hear it.
Hi there. I have a question for Commissioner Wilches. You had mentioned that initially, a couple of years ago, the telco operators were pushing for more regulation on digital services, and they've had a mind shift over time. And I was curious as to what you think was the cause of that over time. What do you think were the main factors?
For them to change the way they thought?
To decide to partner rather than fight.
Well, what I personally have seen is that, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years ago, some companies were not, I guess none of us knew what was going to happen. As time passes, we are understanding a little bit more how those dynamics of the traditional market players have to be combined with the new ones, and how they see that their revenues, in the case of Colombia, go down because consumers, they stop paying what they were paying before, or rates are going down. And that took them a long time to understand that they needed to find a different mix of revenues. And we can see there's a graphic that sometimes we use in our presentations. We see the income from the data and voice. Voice continues to go down. Data was going down, and then it took the other way around, like went up, because I don't know, the offer that they got to the market was probably not increasing tariffs, increasing rates, but trying to offer more services that provided them with additional revenues. And I don't know if that changed. I guess in some way have to come from the directives that they get from their I don't know how to translate that, Casa Matriz, their head operations, some initiatives to, for example, transform digitally. We have an example of that. One of the operators came last week to us. He's proposing for simplification in regulation in terms of what we oblige them to, how we oblige them to attend customers. They want us to move from physical locations or like physical channels to attend customers to digital channels. There are some obligations in regulation that they have to comply with some physical offices, but they're proposing that because from their head office, they're digitalizing the whole company. They're transforming digitally. So it's easier for them to provide a digital solution to their customers, and they're waiting for us to respond. So what we said last week, well, we have that in regulation, but we could think about, we hadn't thought of that. We can think about a sandbox, just try to evaluate how this works with you. We're gonna do some, design some indicators, some way to measure the effect of these kind of solutions, and try to evaluate with customers if they prefer the digital channel or what would they prefer in the future, so that we can work with operators on finding and designing with them the regulation that is better for consumers. Not thinking about the operators or what is better for them, but what is better for consumers.
Thanks, Juan. We have another question.
Thank you, moderator.
Could I ask you to introduce yourself, please? Anybody who has questions, so we know.
Okay. My name is Batu Piluke. I'm from Botswana. I'm working for the regulator in Botswana, a convergence regulator. My question is to Juan. You have given the numbers, the 18% of the regulations that you are eliminating and 5% that you are simplifying. To me, those are very impressive numbers. Maybe just to put it into context, where I come from, the way it's structured is we have the Act, which is the law that establishes the regulation. Then from the Act, we've got another instrument which are called the regulations, which are operationalizing the Act. Then from the regulations, then we've got the licenses, and then we've got the guidelines, we've got the code of conduct and all the other stuff. Now I was just wondering, the other thing maybe just to put in before I go to my question is, for us to change anything that is very significant, we have to go to the core, that is to the Act. And changing the Act means we have to go through Parliament, and it's a very difficult thing. It normally takes about 5 years just to change something. So I'm just wondering, how are you able to make all these impressive numbers, because this is our biggest challenge, that to change all the instruments that are below, we find that we need to amend the parent law, which is the Act. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, that actually brings on another topic, which is about the balance between prescriptive and flexible legislation to allow a kind of the whole framework of regulation to move ahead. I'll ask all the panel members to answer that, and Cordell would like to speak in a minute as well.
Okay. Well, what Gita was saying is quite right. We had a law that was issued in 1990, and starting in the 2001, 2002, all governments tried to modify law, the telecommunications law. It's not that easy. It was kind of difficult, and the modification got in place in 2009. So like 8 years after that. That was a convergent law in the terms of it simplified a lot the rules. It's based on principles. It doesn't specify anything in particular on what needs to be done. And that gave, it opened the possibility of having not just the law, but the regulation associated to that also to be simplified, because it was based on principles. And if we, through the regulation, apply those principles written in the law, well, it's a little bit more flexible. There are some examples, like the case of Mexico or the case of New Zealand in some cases. They have taken decisions about, it depends a lot on how the industry is behaving. I was talking to Simon on Monday on what happened in New Zealand in 2006, if I'm not wrong. Operators they didn't have such good practices in terms of market and competition, and the government decided to include some obligations in the law, bitstream access, local loop unbundling, things like that, that were trying to make the operators behave a little bit better in terms of how they competed against each other. But in the case of Colombia, we're just deregulating. Not every country is in the same place, so we need to think on what is the need, what we need as a country, and try to move or promote those decisions from the legislative or from the executive on how to approach better the situation that we have. So we have to have a good diagnosis of the situation and try to change in the way that our market needs to be changed. Right now we have Congress is trying to take a decision on imposing limitations on the provision of data, the amount of data that you don't use as a consumer, it will be stored for the next period, and that will be stored eternally. So you would start accumulating gigabytes and gigabytes every month. And the response that we're giving to them in our comments to the draft law is you shouldn't regulate that in a law because that would be very restrictive, and it's difficult to change that. And we have to react to how market is evolving. So we need to be very open and not, if we take a decision like that, that will be worse for consumers. And what we're looking for is to have different offers in the market so operators can be a little bit more open and compete with reducing prices and better conditions for consumers. So we comment and we say, from a technical point of view to Congress, what we consider needs to be done.
Alison, would you like to say something?
Yes, for the FCC's part, it's actually very similar to what Juan was just saying. I mean, if the rule is statutory in our Communications Act, then you're exactly right. We can't just repeal it. We would have to go to Congress for that. But many of our rules are implemented very broadly. So we have a lot of, control, I guess, over which ones we decide to streamline or eliminate. And obviously, we have to seek public comment on that before taking any action. But if it is in fact statutory, then it would be much more difficult to change. But like I said, a lot of our rules are, the Congress passed them very broadly and we interpreted them a certain way and perhaps more broadly than we needed to at the time. And the industry has just changed a lot since a lot of those rules were put in place. So it's time to relook at all of them.
Yeah, in Qatar we are in the lucky situation that the law is rather broad based on principles, and very similar to the FCC, we can choose how we're going to implement it in the regulatory regulations, decisions or orders. The one thing in Qatar which is extremely cumbersome is the licenses of the service providers. For example, our incumbent operator, Redo, has a fixed and a mobile license, both in excess of 80 pages. What we're currently doing is to completely pluck those licenses apart, basically delete what's not needed anymore and what's still needed to put it out in more flexible regulations of the CRA.
Thanks very much. Next question from Cordell, I think.
Could I ask the panelists to return to this question of convergence and whether we are being too narrow in how we view convergence and in the institutional frameworks which currently exist. Largely it is, let's bring telecoms and broadcasting together, and sometimes spectrum management, because broadcasting is now being done on the internet and so on. But we heard in an earlier plenary that we ought to be looking at networks in a more expansive way. Telecommunications, electricity, transportation, and what technology portends for those networks coming together and being closer in terms of how we frame policy, so that there could be a case for infrastructure and network specialized regulation on the one hand, and on the other, content regulation, which also is being viewed too narrowly, and that we probably should be thinking about content regulation across platforms and devices, broadcasting, cinemas, video games, social media, virtual reality, which could be another medium by itself, data protection and privacy, which are really content issues or have similar objectives as content regulation. And the range of new issues that are arising around digital literacy, internet addiction disorder, political matters affecting fake news, cyberbullying, etc., etc. And that these things will become overwhelming if they are concentrated, so that we are actually doing convergence in an inefficient way, and that's going to be proved sooner rather than later. What's your view on that?
Thanks, Cordell. I'll just take one more question before we go to the panel.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for a really interesting discussion. Lindsay Fussell from Ofcom in the UK. I think it's a related question, although possibly less about regulatory structures, which, by the way, are a very hot topic in the UK right now. With lots of mixed views about whether we should have a super regulator or whether indeed our regulators do too much and we should break them in different ways. But my question was, I think, related perhaps to Alison's comment about, and Juan's comment about the difficulty of markets now and defining markets. And I guess what's perhaps already apparent to us is that some of our traditional competition diagnoses about barriers to entry being about infrastructure are a bit redundant in the face of some of these new converged broadcasting and digital markets. And I think there's probably an argument for saying that the currency of power now is data. And in particular, the ability, for example, to target your digital advertising very effectively because you have access to loads and loads of consumer data. And I suppose my question is, as competition regulators, should we be concerned about that? It's certainly not a space that we have ever stepped into, but should we be concerned about that, or should we step back and assume that the market, because it's so fast moving, will develop its own solutions, and that we're not seeing market power developing in those kinds of areas? Thank you.
Thanks.